Find somewhere comfortable tonight. You don't need to follow any of this closely. You don't need to hold on to anything that's said or remember it in the morning. Just let the words come to you the way a quiet radio might drift through a room. Present, soft, something to rest against rather than something to grasp. If today was heavy, you can set it down now. Whatever you've been carrying, the worry that kept circling back, the conversation that didn't go the way you hoped, the low hum of something you can't quite name, none of it needs your attention tonight. The day is already behind you. It's already becoming the past, slowly, the way all days eventually do. Tonight we're going to wander somewhere very gentle. We're going to think about consciousness, about what it actually is to be aware, to be here, to feel the weight of yourself against whatever you're lying on right now. It's one of the oldest questions anyone has ever asked. And the remarkable thing, the quietly beautiful thing, is that nobody has fully answered it yet. Not the philosophers, not the neuroscientists, not the people who have devoted entire lifetimes to looking for the edges of this particular mystery. So we're in good company, you and I, sitting with something unresolved. You don't need to concentrate. You don't need to follow the thread carefully. If you drift before we reach the end, that's exactly as it should be. The words will still be here, moving through the room, even after you've gone somewhere deeper. Take a moment. Feel the weight of your body. Notice, just gently, that you are noticing. That quiet fact, the fact that there is something it is like to be you right now, in this moment, is the entire subject of everything that follows. We're in no hurry tonight. There is a question so old and so strange that even asking it properly takes a little effort. Not a difficult effort, more like the effort of trying to look directly at something you usually only see from the corner of your eye. The question is simply this: what is it to be aware? Not what the brain does, not how neurons fire or how signals travel. Those things are fascinating and we'll visit them gently. But underneath all of that machinery, there is something else. There is the fact that when you look at the color of the sky at dusk, there is a redness to it, a warmth, something that lands in you not as data, but as feeling. When you hear music that moves you, something actually moves. Something actually moves. When you are tired, as you may be right now, there is a specific texture to that tiredness, something that belongs entirely to you, that no brain scan. The philosopher David Chalmers, who has spent much of his life sitting with this question, gave it a name. He called it the hard problem of consciousness. And what he meant was not that consciousness is complicated to study, though it is, but that there is a gap, a strange and beautiful gap, between what science can measure and what experience actually feels like from the inside. You can map every neuron that fires when someone hears a piece of music. You can trace every pathway, every chemical, every electrical ripple across the brain. And when you're done, you still haven't explained why it sounds like anything at all. That gap is where tonight's journey lives. It isn't a frightening place. It's actually one of the most peaceful places there is. Because it means that whatever you are, this aware, experiencing, quietly wondering thing that you are, cannot be entirely reduced to the sum of your parts. You are, in some sense, that even the best minds in the world are still trying to articulate, a genuine mystery. And mysteries, the gentle ones, are wonderful things to rest inside. Chapter 1. The long history of a simple word. The word conscious comes from the Latin conscius. It means, roughly, knowing with or having joint knowledge. There is something quietly lovely in that etymology. The idea that to be conscious is not to know alone, but to know in company. As if awareness were always a kind of conversation, even when you're entirely by yourself. The ancient Greeks didn't have a single word for consciousness the way we do. They had words for the soul, for perception, for reason. But the particular idea of being aware of your own awareness, that you are having thoughts and that you know you are having them, that refined, looping quality of mind took a long time to find its language. René Descartes is often the first name that comes up in any serious conversation about consciousness, and with good reason. In the 17th century, sitting alone in his room in the middle of a European winter, he tried to strip away every assumption he'd ever made about the world. He wanted to find something he could know for certain. And what he arrived at, after removing almost everything, was the one thing he couldn't remove, the fact that he was doing the removing, the fact that he was thinking at all. "I think, therefore I am," he wrote. Descartes also gave us a problem we're still untangling. He believed the mind and the body were made of fundamentally different stuff. The body was mechanical, physical, measurable. The mind was something else entirely, something that somehow inhabited the body without being fully part of it. He even suggested, in a way that now sounds endearingly specific, that the two communicated through a small gland at the center of the brain. We now call that gland the pineal body, and we know it has nothing to do with the soul. John Locke, writing a few decades after Descartes, offered a quieter and more grounded definition. Consciousness, he said, was the perception of what passes in a man's own mind. It was an inward observation, not mystical, not metaphysical, just the simple act of noticing your own thoughts as they move through you. It's a definition that still holds up in its way. You're doing it right now if you're following along, noticing the words arrive, noticing what they stir, noticing the noticing. Then came Gottfried Leibniz, the German philosopher and mathematician, who in 1714 made a distinction that feels surprisingly modern. He separated what he called perception, the way the mind represents the external world, from apperception, which was the conscious, reflective awareness of one's own inner states. By the 19th century, a man named Gustav Fechner was trying to do something that his contemporaries found either brilliant or eccentric, depending on who you asked. He wanted to measure the relationship between the physical world and the mind, not philosophically, mathematically. He would ask people to compare two weights, two sounds, 2 points of light, and record the precise threshold at which they could tell the difference. In doing so, he was trying to build a bridge between the measurable and the felt, between the gram and the sensation of heaviness, between the decibel and the experience of sound. He called this new science psychophysics, and it became one. But then something interesting happened. In the 1920s, a psychologist named John Watson decided that all of this inward exploration was unscientific. The mind, he argued, was not a proper subject for science because it couldn't be observed from the outside. Only behavior could be observed. Only behavior could be measured. Only behavior could be measured. It's strange to think about now. An entire generation of researchers agreeing, more or less, to look away from the most intimate thing in the world. The silence didn't last forever. It rarely does. Chapter 2: What the Brain Does When You Are Here. In the 1980s and 90s, something began to shift. New tools arrived. Machines that could watch the brain from the outside while it was still thinking on the inside. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, which could show which parts of the brain were using more oxygen and therefore more active during different kinds of thought. Electroencephalography, which could measure the tiny electrical storms that neurons make when they fire thousands of times per second across the whole surface of the skull. With these tools in hand, researchers began asking the question again. Not philosophically, not mathematically, but empirically. What is actually happening in the brain when someone is conscious? What they found was not a single location. Think of it like a very large orchestra. A single instrument playing alone is just a sound. But when dozens of instruments find a shared rhythm, when the strings and the brass and the percussion all lock together into something coordinated, something larger than any single section, that is when music appears. Consciousness may work in something like the same way. It emerges not from one place, but from the harmony between many places. It emerges not from one place, but from the harmony between many places at once. One of the leading scientific frameworks for understanding this is called the global neuronal workspace theory. It was developed largely by the French neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene, and it proposes something elegant, that a thought or a sensation becomes conscious when it is broadcast widely across the brain, made available not just to one local region, but to the whole system. There is supporting evidence for this in some striking places. People who have suffered damage to the connections between brain regions, not to any one region itself, but to the pathways that link them, often show profound changes in consciousness. The information is still arriving. The processing is still happening. But the broadcast has been interrupted. And without the broadcast has been interrupted. And without the broadcast, awareness dims. Another framework, proposed by Giulio Tononi, a neuroscientist at the University of Wisconsin, takes a different approach. His integrated information theory suggests that consciousness is not just about broadcasting information, but about integrating it, weaving separate streams of data into a unified whole. He has even developed a mathematical measure for this integration, a value he calls phi, which in theory could be calculated for any physical system and would tell you how conscious that system is. The implications of this idea are quietly vast. If consciousness depends on integration rather than on biological material specifically, then it might not be limited to brains. A system with sufficient integration, whatever its physical substrate, might have some form of experience. Tononi himself has suggested that even simple organisms, and perhaps one day certain kinds of machines, might have some small degree of what he calls consciousness. Not human consciousness, not anything like the rich interior life you carry around with you, but something, some faint, distant. These are ideas that science is still wrestling with. They haven't been settled. They may not be settled for a very long time, but they are being taken seriously, which is itself a kind of progress. What researchers do agree on is the role of brainwave frequencies in all of this. When you are awake and alert, your brain produces what are called gamma waves, very fast oscillations, somewhere between 30 and 90 cycles per second. These rapid rhythms are thought to be involved in the binding process, the way the brain stitches together separate pieces of information. The color of something, its shape, its sound, its emotional meaning, into a single coherent experience. When those gamma rhythms are present, when different regions are firing in sync, as you drift towards sleep, as you may be doing right now, those fast rhythms slow. The gamma gives way to alpha waves, slower and softer, the gentle hum of a relaxing mind. Then, as you cross the threshold into actual sleep, the alpha gives way to theta waves, slower still, the frequency of drowsiness and dreaming, and that soft, floating state just before full unconsciousness arrives. And in the deepest sleep of all, the slow delta waves take over. Great, rolling waves of neural activity, vast and unhurried. Each of those transitions is a shift in consciousness, not its disappearance exactly, more like a change in its texture. A deepening, a quieting. The aware thing that you are becoming, for a few hours, something more like water than like fire. Chapter 3. The Hard Problem, and Why It's Actually Beautiful. There is a neurosurgeon named Wilder Penfield who, in the 1930s and 40s, did something extraordinary. He operated on patients with severe epilepsy, and because the brain has no pain receptors, he could perform these surgeries with the patients awake. He would touch different regions of the brain with a small electrical probe, and the patients would report what they experienced. Touch one spot, and a hand would move involuntarily. Touch another, and the patient would hear a long-forgotten melody. Touch another, and they would feel a memory rising up. Not just the content of it, but the full emotional weight, the smell, Penfield was mapping the geography of experience. He was showing with remarkable precision that specific physical actions in a specific physical organ produced specific, vivid, deeply personal moments of consciousness. And yet, Oster. He spent the later part of his career wondering about that observer, about the witness behind the experience. He never arrived at a comfortable answer, and he was honest enough to say so. That witness, that sense of there being the you who is having your experiences, rather than just a brain processing inputs, is at the heart of what philosophers call the hard problem. The hard problem is different. The hard problem is asking why any of this processing feels like anything. Why isn't it all just mechanism, just signals moving through circuits with no inner experience attached? Why is there something it is like to be you? You can't answer that question with a brain scan. You can't answer it with a mathematical formula. You can reach for it, approach it from different angles, find frameworks that make it feel more manageable. But at its center, it remains open. A door that hasn't yet been unlocked. Some scientists find this unsatisfying. They believe that the hard problem will eventually dissolve, that once we understand the brain well enough, the mystery of experience will turn out to have been a kind of illusion, a confusion about how we were asking the question. Others believe the opposite, that consciousness is genuinely fundamental, that it cannot be reduced to physics because it is, in some sense, prior to physics. That is a very large thought to carry into sleep. So perhaps just let it rest at the edges of your mind, gently, without needing to resolve it. Chapter 4. Consciousness in Unexpected Places. One of the quietest revolutions in consciousness research over the past few decades has been the gradual, sometimes reluctant acknowledgement that awareness might not be uniquely human. For a very long time, the dominant view, the evidence has been slowly, gently pushing back against that assumption. In the early 2000s, a researcher named Lynn Snedden at the University of Liverpool conducted a careful study with rainbow trout. She injected a small amount of dilute acid near the mouths of some of the fish while leaving others uninjected. The fish that received the injection began behaving in ways that looked unmistakably like pain responses. They rubbed the affected area against the gravel at the bottom of their tank. They stopped eating even when food was present. They moved with a kind of agitation that the uninjected fish did not show. And when they were given a mild analgesic, the behavior subsided. This is not proof of rich inner experience in fish. It doesn't tell us that a trout lies in a stream and contemplates the nature of its own awareness. But it suggests that something is happening inside that fish that is more than simple reflex. Something that responds to harm in a way that looks, from the outside, like it hurts. The question of consciousness in animals has since expanded in directions that few people anticipated. Crows and ravens have been shown to plan for the future, to use tools to deceive other birds, and to recognize individual human faces and remember them for years. Octopuses, creatures whose nervous systems are organized in a way almost entirely unlike our own, with 2/3 of their neurons distributed through their arms rather than concentrated in a central brain, have demonstrated problem-solving abilities and what appears to be play behavior, investigating novel objects, The Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, signed in 2012 by a prominent group of neuroscientists, stated formally that non-human animals possess the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. It was a careful, considered document, and it shifted something in the scientific conversation. The question was no longer whether other animals might have some form of inner life, but how to study it, and what we owe to beings who experience the world in ways we are only beginning to understand. What this suggests for the nature of consciousness itself is something rather gentle. Rather than being a switch, either on or off, either present or absent, consciousness may be more like a spectrum. A vast, deep gradient of awareness that runs from the simplest organisms all the way through to the most complex minds that evolution has yet produced. Where exactly you are on that spectrum at any given moment depends on many things: your level of alertness, your brain's integration, the richness of the information being woven together inside you. Right now, as you soften toward sleep, you are moving along that spectrum. Not leaving consciousness behind, but entering a different region of it. A quieter, more distant region. One that has its own textures and its own kind of knowing. There is something worth sitting with very softly before we move toward the close. The oldest known piece of figurative art in the world is a small carving found in a cave in southern Germany. It is made from the ivory of a mammoth tusk, and it is roughly 40,000 years old. It depicts a figure that is part human, part lion, a creature that never existed in nature, that could only exist in the imagination of the person who carved it. Researchers who study this object, which is called the Lion Man of Hollenstein, Stadel, believe it represents something profound. The moment in human history when our ancestors became capable of imagining what was not physically present, of holding in the mind a thing that didn't exist in the world. Of combining two real things, a human, a lion, into something that had never been seen, and then rendering it in 3 dimensions with patience and skill over many hours or perhaps many days. This capacity to imagine, to represent, to hold the unreal in the mind alongside the real is considered by many researchers to be a hallmark of the kind of consciousness we carry. Not just awareness of what is, but awareness of what could be. Not just perception, but imagination. The ability to step outside the present moment and wander through possibilities. Someone sat in a cave 40,000 years ago in the faint orange light of a fire and made something that had never existed. And in doing so, they were doing something that you do every night, without effort, without even noticing. They were creating a world inside their mind. Dreams are, among other things, a demonstration of this capacity. Every night, the brain constructs an entire environment, with light and texture and sound and emotion and other people, entirely from the inside. No external input required. The dreaming mind is a reminder that consciousness is not just a receiver, passively taking in the world. It is also a generator, a maker of worlds. The neuroscientists who study REM sleep, the stage of sleep where most vivid dreaming occurs, have found something that is, when you consider it slowly, rather remarkable. The body is still. The muscles are gently paralyzed to prevent us from acting out what we're experiencing. But the mind is as active as it is during the most engaged moments of the day. and it is generating from nothing an entire world. Whatever consciousness is, whether it is a product of the brain's physical processes or something more fundamental that the brain tunes into, or something else entirely that our current frameworks haven't yet found the words for. It is clearly not a simple thing. It is not a light that turns on in the morning and off at night. It is something vast and patient and deeply woven into whatever you are. There is a recent study worth mentioning, not as something to think hard about, but as something to let drift through you. In 2025, a large international collaboration called the Cogitate Consortium, involving researchers from Oxford and many other institutions around the world, brought together scientists who held competing theories about how consciousness works in the brain. Rather than arguing from a distance works in the brain, they agreed to test both theories together using the same participants, the same data. The study didn't settle everything. These things rarely do, and perhaps that's right. But it represented something that feels quietly important, the willingness to sit with uncertainty together, to hold competing ideas with care rather than with defensiveness, to let the question be bigger than any single answer. That feels like a good way to hold consciousness itself, actually. Not as a problem to be solved before you can sleep, but as a vast, gentle, ongoing inquiry that has been underway for as long as human beings have been capable of wondering about themselves. And you are part of that inquiry simply by being here, simply by being aware, simply by lying in the quiet and noticing that you are lying in the quiet. The fact of your awareness, the fact that there is something it is like to be you in this moment, in this particular darkness, is not small. It is, in fact, the most intimate and least understood thing in the entire universe. Every neuroscientist who has devoted their life to this question would agree on at least that much. The brain processes something in the region of 11 million pieces of information every second. Of those 11 million, you are consciously aware of roughly 40. 40 pieces of information out of 11 million make it into the light of your awareness at any given moment. Everything else is happening beneath you, around you, in the vast choir machinery of a body and a brain that know far more than they ever tell you. That means that right now, as you lie here, as your breathing slows and your muscles soften and your thoughts begin to lose their edges, there is an enormous amount of work being done on your behalf that requires nothing from you. Your heart is beating without your instruction. Your cells are repairing themselves. Your immune system is quietly attending to business. Your brain is sorting through the day, deciding what to keep and what to let go, filing memories, releasing tensions, preparing the ground for sleep. You are being taken care of, even now, by the deep and ancient processes that have been running since long before you had words for any of them. There is something in that worth resting into. The knowledge that you don't have to manage everything. That the vast majority of what keeps you alive and whole is happening quietly below the threshold of your awareness, without needing your attention or your effort. Consciousness, the part you can actually access, is the smallest fraction of what you are. The part that wonders and worries and plans and remembers, that part is real, and it matters. But it is floating on something immense, something patient and deep and very old. As you move towards sleep tonight, you are not losing yourself. You are returning to the larger part of yourself, the part that doesn't need to think in order to function, the part that has been doing this for as long as there has been a you to do it. The brainwaves are slowing now, if you've been here long enough. The fast gamma rhythms of active thought are giving way to something softer. The alpha waves of quiet wakefulness, that gentle hum of a relaxing mind, are beginning to fade into the slower rhythms of the threshold. Theta waves, the frequency of drowsiness and dreaming and the soft, floating country between sleep and waking. In that country, the mind does something beautiful. It loosens its grip on the ordinary categories of experience. Things that were separate begin to drift toward each other. Time becomes less insistent. The line becomes less insistent. You may find imagination softens. You may find images arriving that don't quite belong to any particular moment. Fragments of places, faces, colors, feelings that aren't quite feelings that aren't quite feelings. This is the mind beginning to generate rather than receive. Let it happen. There is nothing to resist and nothing to hold on to. The thoughts that are still arriving will find their way without your help. Somewhere behind all of this, behind the brain waves and the neurons and the theories and the ancient ivory carvings and the fish in their rivers and the crows with their long memories and the whole vast, patient inquiry that human beings have been conducting into the nature of their own awareness, somewhere behind all of that is the simple, irreducible fact of you. Now, it is enough. It has always been enough. And so we leave it there in the soft and open country where questions don't need answers, where mystery is a place to rest rather than a problem to solve. The day is already far behind you. Let it stay there, growing distant and quiet, the way all things eventually do. Whatever you are, this aware, wondering, gently breathing thing, you are here. And that is, when you consider it from the right angle, quietly astonishing. Drift now, if you're ready. Weep well. Chapter 1, continued. William James, the American philosopher and psychologist who wrote what many still consider the most beautiful book ever produced on the subject of the mind, spent years in the late 19th century trying to describe what consciousness actually felt like from the inside. His Principles of Psychology, published in 1890, runs to nearly 1,400 pages, and yet the passage most people remember is one of the shortest. He described the mind not as a thing, but as a process, not a noun, but a verb. A stream, he called it, the stream of consciousness. And in choosing that word, stream, he captured something that no diagram or diagram had managed to convey. Consciousness is not a collection of separate moments. James also made an observation that has a particular tenderness to it when encountered late at night. He noticed that the stream of consciousness contains not just clear, vivid, fully articulated thoughts, but also what he called the fringe, the vague, half-formed feelings that surround every clear thought without quite belonging to it. The sense of a word on the tip of your tongue, the feeling that something is about to be understood, the quiet emotional weather that colors every thought without ever being fully named. James believed that this fringe was not noise, not the failure of the mind to think clearly. There is something in that worth receiving softly. The thoughts you can't quite put into words. The feelings that arrive without labels. These are not gaps in your consciousness. They are its texture. They are the water between the visible stones. Chapter 2, continued. Antonio Damasio, a neuroscientist at the University of Southern California, spent decades studying patients whose brains had been damaged in very specific ways, particularly in the regions that govern emotion. One of his most carefully documented cases was a man he called Elliot, a previously successful professional who had undergone surgery to remove a tumor near the front of his brain. And yet, Elliot's life fell apart. He could not make decisions. He would sit for hours weighing trivial choices, which pen to use, where to eat lunch, unable to settle on an answer. He lost his job. His marriage ended. He made a series of financial decisions that were, by any ordinary measure, clearly unwise, and he knew they were unwise, and he knew they were unwise, and he made them anyway. What Damasio found, through careful testing, was that Elliot could no longer feel the difference between options. When he imagined a good outcome and a bad outcome, there was no bodily response, no quickening of the pulse, no faint unease, no warmth of anticipation. Damasio's conclusion was striking. That consciousness, and particularly the kind of consciousness that allows us to navigate our lives wisely, is not a purely cognitive process. It is deeply bodily. The feelings in your chest and your gut and your hands are not decorations on top of rational thought. They are part of the thinking itself. Your body is not a vehicle for your mind. It is, in a very real sense, part of your mind. This is something you can feel right now, if you pay the softest possible attention. The heaviness in your limbs, the particular quality of your breathing, the slight release of tension in your face as the day recedes. These are not just physical sensations happening beside your consciousness. They are your consciousness in its bodily form telling you something true, that you are safe, that the night is quiet, that rest is near. The philosopher Thomas Nagel wrote an essay in 1974 that has been read and reread and argued over ever since. Its title is a question: what is it like to be a bat? Nagel's point was elegant and, once grasped, hard to let go of. Nagel was making a point about the limits of objective description when it comes to subjective experience. No matter how complete your scientific account of a bat's brain, you will not have captured what it is like to be that bat. And the same is true, he argued, of any conscious creature, including you. A complete neuroscientific account of your brain, however detailed, however accurate, would still not be the same as what it is like to be you. This is not a counsel of despair. Nagel wasn't suggesting that science was pointless, or that the hard problem was an excuse to stop trying. He was simply marking something real, that there is a first-person dimension to existence, that third-person descriptions will always approach, but never quite reach. And that this gap, this irreducible privacy of experience, is not a flaw in our understanding. It is a feature of what consciousness actually is. You are, in that sense, fundamentally private, not isolated. You share your experience with others through language and gesture and art and music and the 1,000 other ways that human beings reach across the distance between themselves. But at the deepest level, what it is like to be you is yours alone. It has never existed before. It will not exist again. The particular texture of your awareness tonight, in this darkness, with this tiredness, with whatever you are carrying, that specific configuration of feeling and thought and sensation is entirely singular. There is something very quiet and very important in that. Chapter 4 continued. Plants are not animals, and they are certainly not conscious in any way that resembles what you experience. And yet, in recent years, researchers studying plant behavior have found things that are difficult to explain through simple chemistry alone. Monica Gadiano, a researcher who has worked in Australia and at the University of Western Australia, conducted a series of experiments with a plant called Mimosa pudica, the sensitive plant, the one whose leaves fold inward when touched. She dropped the plants repeatedly from a small height. The fall was harmless, but the mimosa responded each time by folding its leaves. After a number of repetitions, the plants stopped responding. They had, in some functional sense, learned that the drop was harmless. They had habituated, a process that, in animals, is considered one of the most basic forms of learning. And when Galliano tested them again several weeks later, the plants still showed the same reduced response. This is not evidence that plants are conscious. Most researchers are careful to say so. But it does suggest that the capacity to adapt, to change in response to experience, to carry forward something from the past into the present, that these capacities are distributed through the living world in ways that are more various and more surprising than we had assumed. The boundary between the things that respond to their world and the things that respond to their world is not a clean line. It is, like so much in biology, a gradient, a slow, patient shading from one thing into another. What this does, very gently, is widen the frame. It reminds us that consciousness, whatever it ultimately is, did not appear suddenly in human skulls without precedent or precursor. It grew out of something. It evolved from simpler capacities in simpler organisms over vast stretches of time. It evolved from simpler organisms over vast stretches of time. The awareness, you are not separate from that history. You are its most recent chapter. There is a researcher named Adrian Owen who spent years working with patients in what medicine calls a vegetative state, people who had suffered severe brain injuries and showed no outward signs of awareness, no movement, no response to questions, no visible sign that anyone was home. For a long time, medicine assumed that these patients were, in the meaningful sense, not conscious, that these patients were, in the meaningful sense, not conscious. Owen, working at Cambridge and later at the University of Western Ontario, decided to ask the question differently. Using brain imaging, he asked the patient to imagine playing tennis. In a healthy, conscious brain, imagining playing tennis activates a very specific set of regions. The motor cortex, the areas involved in planning movement, the spatial processing areas, and in a significant number of patients who showed no outward sign of awareness, those same regions lit up precisely as they would in a fully conscious person. The patients were there. They were hearing the instruction. They were following it. They were, in some meaningful sense, aware, and there had been no way to know. Owen's work has since led to the development of communication systems that allow some patients with no physical means of expression to answer yes or no questions through their thoughts alone, measurable by the patterns their brains produce in response to different mental tasks. Questions about their comfort, their preferences, their wishes. Answered from within a silence that had previously seemed total. This is one of the places where consciousness research moves from the philosophical into something that feels urgently human. The question of what consciousness is, and where it lives, and how to detect it when it cannot announce itself. Owen has spoken about the experience of that first discovery, of watching a patient's brain respond correctly and unmistakably to his instructions, with a kind of quiet awe that is hard to read without feeling something. He had been working with these patients for years, uncertain whether anything was reaching them. And then, in the scanner, the answer came back. Something was there. Something had always been there. There is also the matter of what happens at the very edges of consciousness, in those rare, fragile moments when awareness is shifting between states in ways that are not quite waking and not quite sleeping. The hypnagogic state, that soft country you may be entering right now, has been studied with growing interest in recent years. It is the threshold state, the one that lives in the doorway between wakefulness and sleep, and it has some remarkable properties. In hypnagogia, the mind produces imagery that seems to arrive from outside rather than being generated from within. Faces that belong to no one you know. Landscapes that are almost familiar, voices speaking words that are almost meaningful. The usual editorial control of the waking mind, the part that monitors thoughts and corrects them and keeps the narrative coherent, has relaxed its grip, and something less managed, more associative, more freely creative begins to emerge. Thomas Edison, who slept very little and napped often, is said to have deliberately cultivated this state. He would rest in a chair with steel balls in his hands, so that when he drifted far enough toward sleep, the balls would fall and the noise would wake him, allowing him to retrieve whatever images or ideas had surfaced in the threshold. You don't need to harvest anything tonight. Let it be free. Let the images come and go without needing to follow them anywhere. They are the mind's way of loosening, the way a hand opens when it finally stops holding on.